Words matter. They can reflect who we are, and they can help to shape who we are. The names and the stories we use can reveal a lot about ourselves and also conceal hidden truths. And sometimes the words and the stories we don't tell and that we don't use can also be equally powerful. Take this place where we are right now, for example. The Adirondack State Park is a 6 million acre mosaic of public and private land in northern New York that's bigger than Yosemite and Yellowstone and the Grand Canyon combined. And our beautiful mountains and lakes are a magnet for visitors from around the world. And our local residents depend on those visitors for our livelihoods. But for most locals and visitors alike, the human story of this place usually begins in the 1800s with the arrival of Anglo-European wilderness guides and hoteliers and lumberjacks. But when we say, "Welcome to the Adirondacks," we often forget that the story of people on this landscape is much richer and deeper and more welcoming than that, as we'll soon see. So the same is true of this small college on the shore of Lower St. Regis Lake. It's named after Paul Smith, who built a world-famous luxury resort here with his wife Lydia in 1859. It's now Paul Smith's College, where I've taught for the last several decades. And we're proud to have Smith as our namesake, but there's a lot more to the story of this place than good old Paul. The words of James Wardner, a local hotelier and a contemporary of Paul Smith, opens a window on a deeper story. In his memoir, he claimed to have advised Paul Smith to build his hotel on the lake about where the Indians are camping. Well, many Adirondackers are actually surprised to learn that Native people have lived on these rugged uplands since the end of the last ice age. That hidden heritage has often been left out of the stories that pass for Adirondack history. But stone artifacts found on our own campus show that people have been living here for thousands of years. And their descendants are still here. The roots of, yes. And we're glad of it. So the roots of human history run deep in these mountains, and we're proud of this chapter in the story of our community. The story of this landscape also includes a more recent chapter that's long been overlooked and misrepresented. My own introduction to it began soon after I moved here, when a friend pointed to a remote stream on the college's property in Onchioto and said, "Guess what that stream's called?" It was N-word Brook. We both wondered what such an unpleasant name was doing here in the welcoming Adirondacks. But nobody in the area seemed to have a valid explanation for it. It was frustrating for me, but it was also a problem for the rest of us at Paul Smith's College. Our faculty were embarrassed whenever students asked about it on field trips. We knew the story of Paul Smith well enough, but nothing about this N-word Brook on our own property. Well, once again, Wardner's memoir opened a new chapter in our story. His version of it wasn't long, and it wasn't pleasant. He said that black settlers cleared some land along a large brook nearby during the mid-1800s. Because of the Negroes, the brook was called by the white people N-word Brook. And they gradually died or moved away. And that's how he ended the story. Well, I wanted to know more, so I turned to the usual source. An amateur historian named Alfred Donaldson wrote a history of the Adirondacks a century ago, and it's still a major go-to document in these parts. Unfortunately, it's full of errors and crude stereotypes. Here's an example of how Donaldson told the story of those black settlers. The Adirondack wilderness, for obvious reasons, was the least attractive and least suited to the Negro. They did nothing for themselves or for their own land. As a Negro colony, it was a failure and soon dwindled away. Fortunately, a new generation of local historians is doing a better job of researching the story of these settlers. With their help and digging around in various archives, I learned that our little brook was part of a much larger story of the Adirondacks and of America itself. It's much more amazing and inspiring than I could have imagined from the way it's been told in the past. During the mid-1800s, this landscape was a hotbed of social activism at a time when it was still legal to enslave human beings. The Adirondacks were the focus of a dream of a better America, an inspiring quest for human equality based on land ownership and multiracial communities in the mountains. Frederick Douglass himself helped to promote Black empowerment through settlement in the Adirondacks during the 1840s. To support that dream, a philanthropist named Gerrit Smith donated 120,000 acres of his Adirondack properties to 3,000 Black settlers from the state of New York, in part to empower them to vote in state elections. Abolitionist John Brown moved here with his family to help the settlers establish their farms and homesteads. Brown and 4 other white Adirondackers would later lose their lives in defense of that dream of human equality at Harper's Ferry in West Virginia. Well, I now wanted a more visual way to grasp the scale of African American influence here, so I began with a map from 1858 that showed where property lots were indicated around my hometown of North Elba. I then used Gerrit Smith's handwritten records to color in every lot that was granted to an African American, and the result was astonishing. Roughly half of those 150 square miles from the high peaks to Bloomingdale and beyond were once Black owned. And adding another sector that included Onchayota and the Brook nearly doubled that amount. Only a few of those landowners actually settled here, but the visual impact of the maps was powerful. This was nothing like what I got from those older sources, and it made me even more determined to find the real story behind our little brook. Well, Wardner's memoir offered another clue when he mentioned one of the local Black settlers by name. John Thomas was one of several Smith grantees who settled in Vermontville, a small hamlet several miles northwest of Lake Placid. We have no photo of John Thomas, but we do have some of his words. In 1872, he sent a letter to Gerrit Smith to thank him for the property and also to tell his own dramatic story. He was born around 1810, enslaved by a plantation owner named Ezekiel Merrick in Maryland. I wore the fetters of slavery for 29 years, he wrote. When Merrick sold his wife and children away to the South, Thomas was devastated, and he decided then to liberate himself. He fled north by way of the Underground Railroad to Troy, New York, where he settled for a time and started a new family with his new wife, Mary. And in 1846, Gerrit Smith gave him an undeveloped property near Plummador Pond, but it was too rugged and remote to be useful. So he explained to Smith in his letter, owing to the inconvenience of church and school privileges, I sold that lot and bought 50 acres near the village. Well, soon the Thomas family had established a prosperous farm among their white and Black neighbors. They grew potatoes and other crops. They raised cattle and sheep, and they tripled the size of their farm. They'd found sanctuary in the Adirondacks, and they were living the dream. But one day, their dream almost became a nightmare. Back in Maryland, Ezekiel Merrick learned of John Thomas's whereabouts and sent bounty hunters north to capture him and return him to bondage. The intruders got as far as Franklin Falls, several miles from the Thomas farm, but when word of this reached Vermontville, friends and neighbors confronted the bounty hunters and drove them off. John Thomas was a valued member of the community by then, and local residents rallied around him as a fellow Adirondacker. So John Thomas embodied the Adirondack ideal of empowerment through land ownership in a multiracial community. And looking back on his life in 1872, he told Smith that, I've breasted the storm of prejudice and opposition. But his next line made it clear that the success story was not without problems. Until I begin to be regarded as an American citizen. That note of irony speaks volumes. For some of his neighbors, his skin color still marked him as an outsider. Wardner's memoir contained crude racial jokes about John Thomas. And the name of the nearby Brook also served as a reminder that a civil war and constitutional amendments had still not brought full equality and justice to the Adirondacks. Even today, distorted versions of the story add further insult to the injury. These farmers were not failures, but hardworking, successful Adirondackers, and they were not mere transients. John and Mary Thomas had found sanctuary in Vermontville and spent the rest of their lives there. They're buried next to each other in the local cemetery. They also left descendants who still live in and around the region. And the Thomas farm is still in cultivation. Its current owner, Denise Griffin, didn't know the amazing story of her property when she bought it, but the name she gave it was more appropriate than she realized at the time. She called it Sanctuary Farm. But what about the Brook? Other streams and landforms in the area bear the names of Thomas's white neighbors. There's Lion Brook, there's Norman Ridge, and even the amateur historian Alfred Donaldson has a peak named after him. John Thomas and his fellow African-American settlers get this Brook name instead. Well, the label was modified several decades ago, but it still identifies these Adirondackers not by their names, but by the color of their skin. So, nice try, but we can do better than that. The time had come for a change. But what could I do as an individual to replace both the story and the name of a landform? As I soon learned, you don't do it as an individual. You do it as part of a community. More specifically, you need to convince the United States Board on Geographic Names to change it. It's not easy, and several friends warned me that it might be impossible. The board's website explained the lengthy process. Once the story is properly documented and a suitable name is chosen, the most important step is to demonstrate local community support for it. But what would my community think of the idea? We Adirondackers can be cantankerous, and we're not afraid to argue over things. Some of us even seem to enjoy it. As it turned out, I didn't need to worry. Throughout the fall of 2022, letters of support came in from the students and the faculty and the staff at Paul Smith College. Local museums, historical organizations, and social justice groups joined in. So did town and county officials. And when I presented the story of John Thomas and the Brook at a local brew pub, dozens of local residents signed their names to a petition too. So in December of 2022, I sent a formal proposal along with the letters and petition to the Board on Geographic Names and waited with fingers crossed. Their decision came the following April. Meet John Thomas Brook. It's official, and it's permanent. Look for it at any up-to-date map of the Adirondacks. Well, we cantankerous Adirondackers do know how to celebrate together, too. In September of 2023, more than 100 people gathered near the Brook in Onchiota. Dave Fadden from the Six Nations Iroquois Cultural Center and Tiffany Ray Fisher of the Adirondack Diversity Initiative spoke about the importance of the name change and the community support that enabled it. But another main point of the gathering was to help make sure that the story behind the name isn't forgotten so easily this time. So we unveiled a historic roadside marker on the college's property, and it reads, John Thomas Brook. John Thomas escaped from slavery in Maryland about 1840 and lived near this brook in Vermontville. But the last words carry special weight. They're a response from this community to the letter John Thomas wrote in 1872, They can still raise a lump in my throat when I read them. As a prosperous farmer and respected citizen. I'm so proud to be part of this community. We saw the need for a change in the story of this beautiful place we love, and we rallied to make it happen. I haven't heard a single voice of opposition to it around here, but maybe some folks elsewhere might accuse us of erasing history by changing the name of N-word Brook. We would disagree. By honoring our fellow Adirondacker in this way, we're not erasing history. We're recovering history that's been erased. Yes. So words do matter. The words we use to describe ourselves and our communities both reflect and shape who we are. The real story of the Adirondacks is not a short, dull monochrome, but a deep, rich, multicultural tapestry of human experience. By uncovering the story of this little brook in the wilderness, we're reconnecting ourselves to a proud chapter of America's story too, when the dream of human equality burned so brightly here in the mountains. That's a heritage we can all take pride in when we say, welcome to the Adirondacks. The real Adirondacks. Thank you for listening.